Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about probably one of my favorite houseplants, the Homalomena Rubescens, also known as the Homalomena Maggie. This is a tropical plant native to Southeast Asia, and it just so happens to make a fantastic houseplant. So I'm going to go through this plant's general care and maintenance, and then give this plant a score. I'm going to be ranking it between easy, intermediate, or hard, based on all the things that are involved in taking care of this plant. So one of the first things that attracts people to this plant as a houseplant is it has these really nice heart-shaped leaves. It's quite glossy and it has beautiful red stems with the green leaves. Quite an attractive plant. And they're quite a bushy plant too, so they look very lush, provided you're taking care of them properly and they're doing well, of course. Now this one's just one of my smaller ones. It's probably about 1.5 feet tall. They get a fair bit bigger than this. They can get up and over 2 foot tall and a lot bushier than this, should you take care of them properly. So this right here, it kind of takes up the whole frame. I can't even back up enough. This is a fully grown Homalomena, or about as big as you're going to get, keeping them indoors, I suppose. I've had this one for maybe 5 years now, maybe 4 years, something like that. And it was originally only about 1 foot tall when I got it, and it was like 5-6 leaves. And it's got more leaves than I can count at this point. As you can see, it's very thick and bushy, kind of all the way around as well. It's pretty dome shaped at this point, and it just pushes up leaves like there's nothing going on. It grows so quick. So given the size of this plant, they make a beautiful centerpiece plant in a room. They're not going to get too big where you're going to have to move it outside after a while. You can keep this indoors permanently as it gets big, but not big enough that it kind of outgrows the room, so to say. So when it comes to finding a place in your home to put this plant, these plants are an understory plant in nature. They like bright to medium indirect light. They cannot tolerate direct sun for too long though. So ideally you'd want this in your room where it gets very bright indirect light, or if it's near a sunny window, it's only getting maybe a bit of morning sun or afternoon sun, nothing too intense for too long, or you just have it a bit far back from a sunny window so it's not actually getting direct sun, but it's getting all the indirect light from said window. Now these are a bit light versatile. Preferably high indirect light is always better for almost all of your house plants. These can tolerate medium indirect lighting, however they will grow significantly slower and they won't probably get as big as this one is here. Another option is if you can't give it the lighting it requires naturally, or at least not enough of it, you can always just use grow lights. Grow lights work really well for these. My smaller Homalomena is actually under grow lights. This one isn't. It's kind of just in a spot in my place that gets natural light, lots of bright light of course, and from that it's grown to this massive plant. My smaller one, it's just under grow lights. It's not as old as this plant, so it's still got some time to go before it reaches this size, but it seems to be growing almost as well under the grow lights as this bigger one is in its sunny window sort of spot. So whether it be grow lights or just natural bright indirect light, this plant does pretty well either way. The bigger one was getting a bit heavy, so I'm back with the smaller one. Now, with this plant's watering, these are honestly very similar to Spathiphyllum. If you've ever kept those before, you'll know Spathiphyllum are very thirsty plants. They like a lot of regular watering and they can't handle dry soil for any length of time at all. These are very much the same and they react just like a Spathiphyllum when they go dry. These are a very kind of dramatic plant and very quick and reactive to their conditions. What I mean is if your soil gets too dry, this plant will almost immediately wilt. You water it, within about half an hour to an hour, it's standing back up like nothing was ever wrong. This plant just cannot handle its soil being dry for too long. So you want to water it regularly. There is a very fine line though between watering regularly and too much. Now this is determined by your soil mix and just reading your plant. So I would advise firstly using a well-draining soil with this plant. You can have a mix of just general indoor plant potting mix with about 5 to 10% perlite mixed through it. That would be fine for these Homalomenas. This enables good drainage so the soil doesn't retain too much water for too long, because that can promote problems like root rot. Because although this plant likes being watered regularly, it doesn't like the soil being saturated, soaking wet constantly, because that, like I said, will promote root rot. The perlite enables oxygen gaps within the soil. This firstly delivers oxygen to the roots, but it enables good drainage as well. So the water can flush through, the soil can start to dry out a bit, This lowers the risk of root rot, which is a fungal bacterial infection. And then when the plant starts to get a bit thirsty, when the soil's almost dry again, you can water again with fresh water. I found I have to water my Homalomena maybe 3 times a week, sometimes even 4 times a week, because their pot does drain through quite quickly. The bigger one's actually due for a repotting soon because I am having to water it a bit more than I should. Ideally, you should only really need to water them maybe twice a week, but this does vary depending on a few things. The soil mix that you're using, the size of the pot, the conditions the plant's living in, like the environment. Like if you live in a more like colder climate, the soil's going to hang on to that water a bit longer than a warmer climate. So I guess it does kind of depend a lot on where you live too and the soil mix you're using. I would also advise, if you're not confident in just being able to read your plant and just know when to water, invest in a moisture probe and use that to determine if your plant does actually need water or not. Pretty much when the moisture probe's giving you a reading that the soil is not fully dry yet, but it's very close to almost fully dry, you're pretty safe to water again. So if you're not sure, just grab a moisture probe. Now these are a tropical plant. They do prefer humidity to be a bit on the higher end of the spectrum. 50% or above is definitely recommended if you want optimal growth from these. However, like I was saying, these are quite a versatile and pretty forgiving plant. They can live in humidity levels that are lower than 50% and do just fine. You're just gonna get much better growth if you have it in a higher humidity. But if you're in a part of the world that has low humidity naturally and there's just not much you can really do about that, don't stress, these will probably do okay. They're a pretty tough plant. You might just find that it won't grow as quick. You might get a few leaves with slight browning around the edges ever so slightly. It's honestly quite subtle with these though. But for the most part, they're pretty durable. But if you can give it 50% or more with humidity, go for it. They'll absolutely love it. Or ideally, if you are, again, in a kind of part of the world where the humidity is naturally lower, you can use a humidifier on this if you really want to, but it's not that necessary. They're pretty tough plants with humidity. When it comes time to fertilize this plant, you don't want to do it too often. I fertilize 1 to 2 times a year with the Homalomenas. I'll do it in spring, I'll leave it go a little bit, then I'll do it again in autumn. Those are the 2 main growing seasons of the year for these. So you can either use a slow release pelletized fertilizer that you just sprinkle on the surface of the soil. It dissolves over time slowly as you water your plants. Or you can use a liquid based fertilizer that you just mix with water and water the plant with that. You can use a seaweed or a fish emulsion. Honestly, again, doesn't matter too much on the exact fertilizer you use. Just buy a general indoor plant fertilizer and you're pretty good to go. These, like I was saying, they're a very versatile plant. Just be sure not to over fertilize, because if you fertilize too much, you increase the level of sodium in the soil a bit too much, which can burn your roots. So fertilize as recommended 1 to 2 times a year. If you're making up a liquid fertilizer in water, follow the directions on the bottle. Don't make it too concentrated because you can hurt your plant. That aside, they're pretty much okay to go with any general indoor plant fertilizer sort of mixture. Now, if you're keeping these plants properly and you're giving them bright indirect lighting, you're watering them semi-regularly, and you notice they are growing quite quickly, which they will if you do everything properly, because these are a very fast growing plant. These ones of mine honestly are producing new leaves almost on a weekly basis. You will need to think about repotting at some point, as they're going to just get bigger and bigger and bigger, or at least they're going to get thicker. The base of the plant's going to get much thicker because it's producing more and more leaves, and you'll eventually need to repot. So you might want to repot every year or every 2 years, depending on the growth of your plant. Only go up 1 pot size each time you do repot though. So if you got it in a 5-inch, go to a 6, then wait another year, go to a 7. Don't go from a 5 right to a 8-inch pot. You risk root rot because there's too much excess soil in the pot that the plant's roots haven't gotten to yet. And when you water, that wet soil is basically just going to hang on to that water. It's not going to go to the plant. Instead, it's just going to sit there and almost start to rot and go a bit fungal and produce bacteria, which can cause root rot. These plants actually don't mind being kind of compact in a pot for a while anyway, so don't rush to repot. If you're not sure if it does need a bigger pot yet and it's just on the fence with it and you're not confident, just wait another year. It's not going to be a problem. These plants are pretty good during winter. as well. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen any of my other plant videos where I've done videos about, for example, alocasia. They go dormant in winter and they kind of go from being a beautiful plant in spring to a very ugly plant in winter. Some die completely back to nothing. These don't do that. Homalomena Rubescens kind of keeps going all year round. Now it might slow down a little bit in winter time, but it's not going to die back. And even when it goes dormant, it never really stops. Like, it still produces leaves, at least mine do, in winter time. And it does get kind of cold here in winter. Mine will still grow leaves, just a bit slower than in spring. You'll also find that during winter, you won't need to water them as frequent because the colder weather is not drying the soil out as quick. So yeah, they do slow down a little in winter, but they're a great plant to have if you don't like plants that go dormant during winter and end up looking really ugly because they're kind of dying back throughout the colder times of the year. These kind of look fantastic all year round, for the most part. Another great thing about these plants is, at least from my personal experience, I've never known them to have any problems with pests. Now, I have quite a few plants in my collection that can be kind of pest prone, and the variety of pests vary from one plant I have to another. So I've seen a lot of different pest insects on various plants I've had over the years, and I've kind of seen which ones tend to stick to certain plant species and not others. And from what I've noticed is Homalomena Rubescens, for whatever reason, pests generally don't like them. I have yet to have any spider mites or mealybugs or scale or anything like that on these plants. They're in the same room as all my alocasia that get spider mites every year, and I have to keep kind of proactively treating them. And none of those spider mites seem to jump over the Homalomenas. This Homalomena is actually on one of my cupboards that I have grow lights mounted above that I have all of my smaller plants growing on. And it's actually surrounded by various species of alocasia, which will occasionally get a spider mite problem kind of on and off, which I have to keep proactively treating every 6 months or so. And none of those spider mites, even though the alocasia are in direct contact with this, they don't seem to jump over to it for whatever reason. They just don't like it. So they're a fantastic plant regarding pests. They just generally don't get them. The only bad thing about this plant I will mention, it might be just bad for some of you, it kind of depends a lot here. These are toxic to pets. Their sap in the leaves and the stem contain calcium oxalate crystals, which if ingested will cause mouth swelling and irritation, mouth ulcers, swelling of the throat. If it gets into the stomach, it'll cause stomach problems as well, such as gastrointestinal irritation and swelling. You can get ulcers on the inside of your stomach from it as well. So it's just generally not a good thing to have in your system. It can cause vomiting as well as just a lot of cramping and pain as well. So it would definitely be a trip to the vets if your dog or cat ate some of this plant. To propagate these is pretty easy as well. Now, they're not as simple as taking cuttings, but they're not that difficult either. You do have to wait till they're quite large. So my bigger Homalomena that I was holding at the start of the video would be perfect for propagating if I wanted to do that. Basically, you split the plant. So I can kind of show you the smaller one. So if you look at the base of this plant here, that's one plant there, and that's another plant there. There's actually two plants. This started out as one, and as it gets bigger, it ends up producing two areas where leaves grow from rather than one. So that can be sectioned off into two separate plants. My bigger one's probably got 4 or 5 of that going on. Now, basically what you do is you just wait until it's time to repot the plant. You clean off the roots as best you can from a majority of the soil, so it's just easy to work with. You then either use your hands and kind of just gently break the two plants apart, or if you get a sharp knife, you can just split it with a knife. You just want to make sure both halves have roots on them. Otherwise, if you do split these apart and one half doesn't have any roots attached to itself, good chances it won't make it. Provided you split these and each half has some roots on them, they should do fine. But you want to wait until they're bigger. As far as the general maintenance on this plant goes, there's not much you really need to worry about, apart from, like I was saying, you might have to water it a few more times than other species of plant that you might have in your home. That aside, there's not much you really have to do for them. It's pretty standard plant stuff. Any dead or dying leaves, you cut them off. So the plant's not wasting chlorophyll on those leaves. You cut them off, it can divert that excess energy to new growth rather than putting it into leaves that are basically going to die anyways. So other than removing dead leaves, you just want to wash it down regularly. I often say wipe your leaves down because dust collects on them, and by all means, if you want to do that for these plants, there's no problem there. It's more a thing of when they get to a point like my bigger one, where it's probably got a good 50 plus leaves, wiping them down one by one with a damp microfiber cloth or a paper towel is kind of a waste of time, especially when you have lots of other things to do. So I would just put it in the shower and give it a bath. Pretty much just put the plant in the shower, turn the tap on, let it get rained on for 5-10 minutes, and then pop it back where it goes. You only have to do this maybe once every few weeks, maybe once a month or something, not too often. This is great for the plant because it keeps the leaves nice and clean, and it helps deter pests. Like I was saying, they're not really prone to pests anyway, but showering the plants does help deter any little hitchhikers that might be on there, even if they're nothing that bad. But regardless, you're keeping the leaves nice and clean by showering this plant, enabling the plant to photosynthesize properly. Rightio, so given this plant's versatility with lighting and humidity, and the fact that it doesn't really get pests at all, and it's just generally a beautiful plant that is pretty hard to kill unless you stop watering it, I'm gonna rank this plant easy. I reckon anyone could keep this plant as long as they have the basic information with them as to what it needs, which isn't anything that difficult to give. So for that, this plant gets a score of easy. So that's my video on the Homalomena Rubescens, also known as the Homalomena Maggie. If you've enjoyed this video, guys, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Buy me a coffee if you like, it helps support the channel. There's a link in the description for that, should you want to do so. Until then, guys, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.